So a little bit about the project. The Franklin Avenue Bridge is owned by Hennepin County. HNTB was the designer. Wiz Janney, Elsner Associates did the concrete repairs, and the contractor was Kramer North America. The Franklin Avenue Bridge is located just downstream of I-94. We've got where you can see the hotel here and where we're at in the conference hall. We are forgetting one bridge on here, which is the City of Minneapolis' 10th Avenue Bridge, but if you do have time and you're in town, there's a great collection of historic bridges, arch bridges like this built in the 20s that are very close to us here if you want to go take a look at them. The Franklin Avenue Bridge is a historic structure. It was originally designed by Frederick W. Capellan in 1918 and constructed in 1923. When it was constructed, it was the longest concrete arch bridge in the world. It was listed on the National Register in 1978 and became a Minneapolis landmark in 1985. It also belongs to the historic Grand Rounds District. It's a participating element to that district. So all work had to be done. It had to follow the Section 106 process, and all work had to be completed per the Secretary of the Interior's standards. This one I just always like to throw in there. Back in the 20s, you know, with all the ABC and things we do nowadays, back in the 20s they built this arch around the existing truss bridge. And the way I understand it, used the existing truss bridge to bring materials and things out to the project. So overall, the project obviously had concrete restoration. We repaired the abutments, piers, and the arch ribs. We also, underneath an accelerated closure, we replaced the deck, the cap beams, with precast elements. The precast elements consisted of the deck panels and the cap beams and one-piece ornamental rails. We also had to widen the bridge on the east end for a 5-legged interchange to handle all the queuing and things that happened down there, so we had to widen the east end. And we also, through this, we were able to restore many historic elements that were removed in the 1980s when they removed everything down to the arch. We had the historic concrete railing, historic pilasters. We have nice scrolled ends on all the cap beams. So we were really able to restore a lot of the historical architecture of the time. The bid price for the project was $43 million. So schedule-wise, this project started quite a while ago. In 2007, WJE did the initial investigation on the project. In 2013, HNTB and WJE and several other subconsultants that were crucial to the project were hired, and we did the rehab design. WJE also did another inspection in 2013, and I believe Mark will get into that and has some pretty interesting pictures of just in that time frame, the deterioration that occurred. So the first year, 2015, was all concrete restoration and prefabricating all the precast elements. In 2016, they continued with the concrete restoration, but the accelerated bridge closure happened where we removed the deck and installed all the precast elements. That was all done in a 116-day closure. So in 2017, we continued to finish out the concrete restoration and do the final coatings and things of that nature. We do have articles out there in Concrete International, a 2-part article if you'd like to know more about the bridge, or you can catch me or Mark afterwards. Part 1 speaks more to the rehabilitation, and Part 2 gets more into the accelerated bridge construction and the design.
I'm Mark Chauvin, and with the remaining time today, I'm going to touch on the substructure and the work that was done to repair the substructure, both highlighting the deterioration that was present and then some of the repair strategies that were employed to address that. But first, before we get into it, I'll give you a sense of the structure. It's actually relatively simple. It consists of the arch ribs spanning pier to pier or pier to abutment, which support spandrel columns, cap beams, and then the bridge deck above. And as Dan mentioned, the deck, the spandrel columns, and the cap beams were all replaced in 1970. So the substructure and the large focus of our work was the piers and the arch ribs, which were original and dated to 1923. And one of the more unique aspects was the arch ribs did not contain reinforcing steel bars, but instead were reinforced with the Milan truss system, which we can go into a lot of detail about it, but effectively it's back-to-back double angles with interconnected bracing members that form trusses, effectively, with gusset connections. And so that was one of the the challenges, I guess, with the arch ribs was that particular system. The deterioration that was present on the arch ribs in most areas consisted of longitudinal cracking over the outer corners, both at the top outside corners and then also at the lower corners, as you can see in the upper left photo. And unfortunately, as cracking developed, generally as a result of corrosion, that allowed moisture to ingress to the level of the steel. And that moisture, given our climate, can freeze. And you can get freeze-thaw damage, which results in more cracking, which can let more chloride in, and it can become a downward spiral, if you will. And so the photo on the upper right, there's both chloride-related corrosion of the angle and then some freeze-thaw damage, a little more advanced freeze-thaw damage in the lower left below an expansion joint. And as those conditions combine and you get spalling of that corner, you can see the exposed corrosion of that double angle of the Milan truss in the lower right. But with the arch ribs, it was generally freeze-thaw damage and chloride-induced corrosion. At the river piers, the outward-facing sides of the river piers were generally in good condition, and there was some carbonation-induced corrosion, but as you can see in the image, all in all, they were in pretty good shape. On the interior surfaces, particularly in areas where deck drainage was poor or diverted directly onto some of these surfaces, there was some pretty heavy freeze-thaw damage, as the image in the lower right. Hopefully you can see that. And then particularly at the river line, there was some very deep freeze-thaw damage, which I'll get into a little bit later. However, the land piers were a bit of a different story. There were 2 piers on each edge of the river, and out of the 15 expansion joints in the deck, there were 2 on each side of each of the land piers. And as you may know, expansion joints leak over time, and this was a 1923 bridge. So leakage over a long period of time resulted in both chloride-induced corrosion and then also freeze-thaw damage, which the call-out photo in the upper right is an area of freeze-thaw damage below a leaking joint. And the damage on those land piers was pretty advanced. And as Dan mentioned, our first investigation was for Hennepin County in 2007. The image on the left is one of the land piers and a photo we took at that time, where you can see some evidence of corrosion-related damage, chloride-induced corrosion, directly below one of the deck expansion joints. 6 years later, when we were out updating repair quantities and getting another look at the bridge, you can see visually the extent of the deterioration and the progression. And this should be somewhat intuitive that deterioration isn't a static thing. It's not going to happen and then stay the same. Chances are it's going to keep progressing, if not accelerating. And this is just one example of one element on the bridge where that was certainly the case. And that's just 6 years' time. So to assess the deterioration, really before you can develop repair strategies, the first thing you need to do is understand what it is you're trying to fight. And so our work started with a visual inspection of the bridge, where we're identifying all the deterioration that we can see. That's supplemented with a delamination survey, because I'm sure, as many of you know, the extent of damage is not always what you can see. The extent of delamination can be beyond that. There can also be areas that appear sound and are in fact delaminated. And then based on those results, we selected some study areas to do non-destructive testing, which included a host of the typical techniques from reinforcing steel location, corrosion rate testing and half-cell potential testing, resistivity testing, which was a consideration for the repairs, carbonation testing, and then steel thickness, ultrasonic testing, and core sample and steel sample removal for some strength testing. That was followed up with a laboratory study where we petrographically examined some of the core samples to better understand the concrete and some of the distress that was present. We did chloride content analysis to figure out what the chloride levels were, and as just one graph of one subset of cores. But generally what we found was the chloride concentration at the level of the steel was above the corrosion threshold. And that was the case even in areas where there was not distress. Concrete that looks sound and yet has chloride levels that are high enough to promote corrosion. And so that was something we needed to be mindful of as we're designing repairs. And then lastly, we tested both concrete and steel samples for strength for HNTB to consider in their analysis and load rating of the bridge. And so to develop repair strategies, we needed to bundle and consider all of that together, the visual inspection, the NDT, the laboratory inspection, and identify for each element what is the deterioration mechanism. What are we trying to fight, and then develop repairs to defeat those mechanisms. And through that, you develop your battery of rehabilitation alternatives, which obviously range in both their estimate of service life, the time before you have to go back, as Paul just discussed, life cycle cost comparisons from initial investment to total investment, and then also, because this was on the historic register, we needed to be sensitive to the historic fabric of the bridge and the impact that any repairs we might design would have on it. So just to look at the piers and the arch ribs, again, the mechanisms were chloride-related corrosion through leaking expansion joints, and in areas where the joints leaked profusely, there was also freeze-thaw damage. Areas where you had drainage issues, there was freeze-thaw damage, and then certainly at the water line. And so we needed to develop repairs that would address those. But then we also needed to be mindful of areas of sound concrete, again, that were chloride contaminated, and because it's 1923 concrete, it was not air entrained. Air entrainment wasn't used until the 30s, so all of this concrete and all of the reinforcing steel in it, the chloride levels were high enough, and the absence of air entrainment created a risk that we could walk away from the bridge and not prevent damage from developing in some of these adjacent areas in a short amount of time. So the goal was to keep water out of the concrete and then employ targeted cathodic protection where warranted. So I won't get into all the details of the rehabilitation design. As you can imagine, in a limited amount of time, it's kind of challenging to do. But again, all of the details were designed once we identified that deterioration mechanism to address it, and then also to be historically sensitive. And so there's 5 aspects of the repair that were a little bit unique, I guess, and I'll try and touch on those now. And the first was this idea of keeping water out of the concrete. Generally for historic structures, film-forming coatings are not well received or not an option. This particular structure had a number of coatings that had been applied over the years, and so through discussions with the historians, and obviously given the risk of if you don't coat it, there's a risk you're going to lose historic fabric. So there was a discussion and decision ultimately made to select a special surface finish that was thin enough so that we would still see the board form finish, which was one of the historic features. That color matched the original buff concrete that would be durable and high performing, and most importantly would protect that original concrete that is not air entrained and generally had very high chloride levels. One of the second unique things was the ability to eliminate expansion joints. Through the analysis work that HNTB did, this bridge that had 15 expansion joints in the deck, that number was ultimately reduced down to 6, and none of the joints are located over a pier. So that bodes well for the piers and arch ribs moving forward. There's just that many fewer vehicles, I guess, available for allowing water to get down to those substructure elements that we're trying to restore. The third, again, was targeted cathodic protection, and the focus for that work was primarily those corner double angles of the Milan truss system where there was at a minimum longitudinal cracking along the angles. Generally speaking, there was also some spalling and corrosion, and so both at the upper and lower corners we targeted this an anode system to protect those elements moving forward. And some views of that. On the left-hand side, you can see the slot that was cut in an area where there was just cracking and not a spall, where we're not already employing a repair. There was an anode that was sized and installed and connected to the truss to delay corrosion of those elements. And then the photo on the right is that lower corner where instead of trying to install it overhead, it was cut into a slot on the side of the element. And then there were discrete locations between where anodes were installed to try and prevent that ring anode effect of some of the interior trusses. And again, all of that was connected to the truss reinforcement. And an image looking down at one of the arch ribs where again you have these anodes along the sides in locations that would generally be out of sight of people below the bridge that are then run to a test station where the system could be commissioned and then periodically monitored to verify that it is in fact working. Because the service life of the anodes, I think, is 20 years. The fourth was down at the water line where the freeze-thaw damage was up to about 2 feet deep. Rather than removing or excavating out 2 feet of concrete, the design was to remove the outer 12 inches and then let the inner 10 inches or so of damaged concrete remain. And then a new pier jacket was installed to provide water protection and confinement of that concrete. Some images of that going in was done with cofferdams, and that outer 12 inches was removed. Dowels and reinforcing were installed and formwork, and then concrete was placed, and you can see the finished product on the bottom to kind of restore that nosing of the piers, and again, protect the historic concrete. And then lastly, so that our repairs matched in, not only did we select a coating that matched the original color, but that would then be applied to kind of blend some of the repair areas to the original, but the repair areas also received this board form finish. So it was a shotcrete repair, and then using either a 4-foot board or a float with some piano wire, that board form finish was replicated on some of these shotcrete repairs so that areas of repair resembled the areas of original concrete that were immediately adjacent to it. So that's a pretty high-level overview of about a 10-year project. But
for chloride concentration threshold, you showed on the vertical axis the concentration of chloride by weight. So what do you mean by weight? Weight of concrete or cement?
weight of concrete.
Weight of concrete. You know, there is pressure from our superior there to measure it by weight of cement, because lots of agencies in the States here doing it by weight of cement. And I don't find a way to measure it by weight of cement. Unless, and especially for an old concrete, you don't know what the cement, how much cement they put in the concrete.
Yeah, that's right. So the question was the graph that I threw up of the chloride content by depth, whether it was weight of cement or weight of concrete. It was presented, I believe, is weight of concrete, because as we're collecting this data, it's all based on cores. And so we can measure the weight of concrete, but we don't, unless we know the full mix design, we don't know what the weight by cement would be. So in terms of pressures or ideals of ways to represent it, I guess I can't really speak to that. But in general, we've used weight of concrete just because that's something we know. Everything else has to be estimated.
Thank you.
The preceding video was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found at tsp2.org. That's tsp2.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.